Rachel Naylen has been granted the right to stay in the house until the children finish high school, while Mr. Bennett will continue to cover the mortgage and utility payments. She's also entitled to half of the value of her husband's business, and he will keep up the payments on her car. Mrs. Bennett is awarded 60% of the couple's assets, including bank accounts, investments, and retirement funds. The primary custody of their children has been given to her, with visitation following the usual guidelines. Mr. Bennett gets 2 consecutive weeks in the summer and every other weekend. Child support has been set at $750 per child, totaling $1,500 a month. Since Mrs. Bennett has been out of the workforce for the past 5 years, an additional $2,000 per month in spousal support is included. The divorce will be finalized in 90 days unless Mr. Bennett chooses to withdraw the petition, bringing the proceedings to an end. Judge Laura Bennett brought down her gavel and started to rise. It was then that I uttered a single word that would set the stage for what would be some of the most dramatic months of my life. I responded to her challenge, stating that I didn't quite understand what was so hard to grasp. I even offered to define it for her if the word was causing her trouble. Judge Bennett froze mid-motion, her head spinning so sharply it looked like her neck might snap. Her face displayed utter disbelief, as though the very idea of someone speaking that word in her presence was unfathomable. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, and as she did, her expression shifted from shock to sheer fury. Once seated, the icy glare she shot at me was enough to freeze water on the sun. To say she was angry wouldn't do it justice. She told me she wasn't stupid, that she knew exactly what was going to happen, and frankly, she didn't care. The next few minutes were already planned, and she gave me exactly 1 minute to apologize, or she'd hold me in contempt of court. I responded, saying at least she'd have made one correct decision that day. I added that I had nothing but contempt for the entire situation. My lawyer hissed at me, frantically rifling through his briefcase, probably trying to find something that would quiet me down. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett sneered, slammed her gavel again, and threatened to see how much contempt I had after spending 30 days in jail. I shot back, suggesting she might as well make it 60 days and asked if she wanted to push for more. I added that if she got laid more often, maybe she wouldn't be such a miserable person. As I spoke, I extended my right hand, flipping her off, while my left hand mimicked the same gesture. I told her she could ride those fingers to a climax, which might soften her up a bit. In my opinion, she was in more desperate need of change than any woman I'd ever encountered. I couldn't help but reflect on the situation, wondering if someone had called emergency services around that moment. I considered 2 possible scenarios. Either her head was about to explode, or she was having a stroke. It was a relief that I couldn't actually see the smoke coming from her ears. I didn't think it was even possible for someone's face to turn that shade of red. After my outburst, she was clearly shaken, and she handed down a 90-day sentence. Her voice took on a menacing, almost demonic tone, and I was swiftly escorted out by the BFFs. My lawyer looked like he'd just witnessed a disaster, and the entire courtroom went silent as I struggled to hold back my laughter. It was probably this laughter that led to the visits from psychologists during my time in lockup. The letter from my lawyer's firm the next day, informing me that they were dropping me as a client, didn't come as a surprise. So, you're probably wondering what all that was about. Well, let me give you some context. My name is Michael Bennett, and I'm currently 31 years old. I was born into a decent middle-class family in the heart of America. My upbringing was steeped in traditional values, where there was always a clear sense of right and wrong. You respected those who earned it, and cheating was never an option. When you gave your word, it meant something. The principles I was raised on were simple. Work hard, be generous with what you have, and live according to your values. Treat others how you want to be treated. Of course, most people don't really think about the flip side of that rule. Treat others as they've treated you. The Christian thing to do, they say, is to turn the other cheek. But if I'm being honest, I've never been good at that. I've always had what people describe as an extreme stubborn streak, along with a deep sense of justice. The combination isn't always pretty, especially when I make up my mind that someone's wronged me. Once I decide how I'm going to handle it, there's no turning back. There's this one time in high school that stands out. I was dating Linda Carter at the time. We'd been seeing each other for a couple of months when we had a fight about something, and, as was often the case, it led to a breakup. I say breakup, but it was more of a temporary cooling-off period. We'd both cool down, apologize a couple of days later, and get back together. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and we'd gotten used to it. Take the weekend to think things over, then make up by Monday. But one Saturday evening, as I was walking past the theater, I saw something that would change everything. My cousin, James, was escorting Cheryl into the theater. Here's the thing, James wasn't just my cousin. He was more like a brother. We were the same age, practically inseparable growing up, and his family lived right down the block. We were as close as family could get. But I also knew James had feelings for Cheryl, and while he knew about our breakup, he knew we'd probably get back together after the weekend. But we just didn't do that to each other. From that moment on, James was dead to me. When Cheryl tried to talk to me on Monday, I refused to even acknowledge her. On Sunday at church, James came up to me trying to talk things through, but I just stared at him. When he finished speaking, I turned around and walked away without a word. When his family came over for Sunday dinner, I ignored him. He tried to play video games with me, but I just left and went to my room. My parents tried more than once to get me to talk to him, but I refused. Even a year later, after I took his girlfriend, I still wouldn't speak to him. I did give him a smack when he confronted me about it, but that was the extent of it. He sent me a wedding invitation years later, and I ignored it. When I married Rachel, every single member of my extended family got an invitation, except James. Okay, so maybe I'm a little bit of an idiot for holding grudges. But here's the thing. When someone wrongs me, I don't forgive unless it was truly an honest mistake. What James and Cheryl did wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Right now, many of you are probably thinking I'm an idiot, but let me stir the pot a little more for you. I believe firmly that if you commit the crime, you should face the consequences. If you make a foolish mistake, you need to own it. If you're driving drunk and get caught, don't be surprised when you lose your license, your insurance goes up, and you have to do community service or whatever else is part of the penalty. If driving is a key part of your job, expect to lose that job too. That's what I call a foolish tax. If a girl chooses to engage in unprotected sex and ends up pregnant at 18, her foolish tax is being called mommy for the next 18 years. If a guy gets a girl pregnant, he better step up and take care of the kid. He was half responsible for creating it. Choices have consequences, and that's called personal responsibility. I refused to be the one paying for someone else's idiocy. So, I worked hard through high school, kept my grades up, and earned some great scholarships. I went to college, did well with the ladies, and still kept my grades up. I was always on the better-looking side and worked hard to maintain my health. Yeah, I'll admit I'd been involved in my fair share of fights back in high school, mostly because I stuck to my guns on my personal beliefs. I definitely came out on top more often than not. As time went on, I stayed in shape and it seemed like women noticed. When I graduated, I had an economics degree and a minor in accounting. After that, I went on to get my MBA. Eventually, I landed a solid job with a good salary at a large company. Since I was still single and didn't have many expenses, I got into the stock market. Turned out, I had a natural talent for it and made quite a bit of money in the process. A few months into my new job, I met Rachel at a party. We hit it off instantly, and I asked her out. She said yes, and things just progressed from there. I'm not afraid to admit she was beautiful, though let's be real, when has any guy ever said their girlfriend was unattractive? I'm sure someone out there could have found her less than appealing. But to me, she was stunning. And it wasn't just me. Every time we went out, heads turned. My friends would joke that if we ever broke up, they'd try to move in. Even some of my lesbian friends joked about turning her if she became available. Eventually, I asked her to marry me and she said yes. Now, I should mention that Rachel did go to college, but I like to joke that she was there for her M degree, her Mrs. degree. Of course, she didn't exactly get that, but she did manage to graduate with a degree in art history, which qualified her to work as a barista at Starbucks. For anyone not familiar, a Mrs. degree is what people call it when a girl goes to college just to delay adulthood and ends up graduating with a husband who'll take care of her for the rest of her life.
Yeah, I'm arrogant.
Deal with it. So we settled into married life. A week before the wedding, she quit her job and started focusing on being a homemaker. As for our sex life, well, it was great. We bought a beautiful 3-bedroom house, and I was doing well at my job while making a tidy sum playing the stock market. We weren't living excessively, but we were able to save up a decent amount of money. All my bonuses went straight into investments, and I maxed out my retirement contributions. My goal was to retire before I turned 40, and I planned on making Rachel's life as good as possible. My hard work was paying off. The company recognized it, rewarding me with generous bonuses and promotions that had me climbing the corporate ladder faster than I expected. A few years into the marriage, I came home one Friday to find Rachel dressed up like she was ready for a night on the town, a big smile on her face. "Hurry up and get showered. We're going out to celebrate, Daddy." I froze. Did she just call me Daddy? Couldn't believe it. We'd been trying for a while, but I didn't expect her to tell me so suddenly. When she said it was finally happening, I lifted her up and spun her around, kissing her all over. Felt surreal. We spent the night celebrating, our spirits high with the excitement of the new life we were about to bring into the world. Then, a few months later, another shock. Twins. 2 little girls. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to spoil them, to have 2 little daddy's girls who would wrap me around their little fingers. Life felt perfect. The day arrived, and we rushed to the hospital. A few hours later, our 2 beautiful, healthy girls were born, with all their fingers and toes. As twins, they had to stay a bit longer in the hospital, but everything went smoothly. When we brought them home, both our families were there to greet us, and everyone was thrilled. I noticed my mom was watching them closely, probably because I'd finally given her the grandchildren she'd been waiting for. Life had definitely changed. I realized that working for the big company was pulling me away from my family too much. With the money I had saved up, I decided it was time to start my own business. I had done well with my investments and figured I could help others do the same. I got the necessary licenses, opened an investment firm, and started making things official. A few of my friends and family members became clients right away. Once I opened my doors, I had former colleagues transferring their portfolios over to me. Within a year, I had a solid client base, and more people were talking about me to their friends. Things were looking up. When you're on top of the world, the only place to go is down. It was the girls' 2nd birthday party, and we had turned it into a full-blown production. Sure, they wouldn't remember it, but it was a celebration they could watch in the future and enjoy all over again. All our family from both sides was there. The atmosphere was fantastic, and everyone was having an amazing time. That is, until I was about to leave the bedroom after using the private bathroom. The hall bathroom had been occupied, so I was waiting to come out when I overheard my mom talking to her sister in the hallway. She was saying she couldn't figure out where the girls' blue eyes came from. Her sister, Mayan, suggested she ask me about it. My mom replied, wondering what would happen if I found out that the girls weren't mine. She seemed worried about how happy I was and thought it would probably devastate me. I couldn't take any more of it. I quickly retraced my steps back into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I needed to think. They had to be mine, right? Surely someone in our families had blue eyes. My eyes were a muddy brown, and Rachel's were more of a hazel shade, I thought. I mentally ran through all of our relatives, trying to find a connection. The only person I could think of who didn't have brown eyes was my cousin Mary, whose green eyes came from her non-blood-related father's side. But Rachel's side? I couldn't recall anyone on her side of the family with blue eyes. After some time, I knew I had to pull myself together and rejoin the party before anyone started noticing I was missing. I suppressed my emotions and put on a cheerful face. Despite what was going on inside, I acted as though nothing had changed and returned to the festivities. The rest of the evening passed, but I couldn't shake the thoughts that had begun to churn in my mind. Eventually, the party wound down and people started leaving. While putting the girls to bed that night, I studied their faces, searching for any features that might match mine. Some of their features resembled Rachel's, but others were unrecognizable, and I couldn't find anything that seemed definitively like me. The next day, while Rachel napped with the girls, I ordered supplies for my office, using a company credit card so the invoice wouldn't be noticed. I also began researching local private investigation firms, as the suspicion that Rachel might have cheated on me nearly 3 years ago was growing stronger by the minute. If she had cheated back then, was she still doing it now? I needed proof. I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. A few days later, my supplies arrived, and I met with the private investigator I'd hired, a firm called Pro Investigations. I gave them everything they needed to gain access to Rachel's cell phone, tablet, and laptop. At the same time, I started making financial moves. If my suspicions turned out to be wrong, none of this would matter. But if I was right, these actions would protect my money. I wasn't going to keep funding her infidelity or take care of someone else's children while my girls remained innocent victims, and I was the fool. If she had messed around and gotten pregnant by another man, they could bear the responsibility, not me. Nothing was finalized, but I waited for the proof. 2 weeks later, I received the letter at work. I locked my office door, sat down, and opened it. As I read, I cried for an hour. Deep down, I had suspected this truth all along, but I had clung to hope. The following day, the private investigator met with me and provided all the proof. Rachel had been seeing her blonde-haired, blue-eyed personal trainer for the past few years. She'd been meeting him 2 days a week and even taking the girls to his apartment. The audio recordings confirmed they were both aware of the real father. The next afternoon, I met with a divorce lawyer. I wasn't interested in his typical advice about putting the kids' best interests first. I had other priorities. I insisted we prepare the documents but hold off on filing until the right moment. The preparations took about 2 months. With no assets or income officially listed under my name, I left Rachel completely blindsided when my cousin Peter and his wife Cheryl showed up at our house that weekend. I told her that Peter and Cheryl had come to my office a couple of weeks ago. After some serious talks, they admitted their mistakes and apologized. I told her I had forgiven them and was moving on. Goddamn. You people are so gullible. I laughed as I explained further. Yes, Peter and Cheryl did visit me in my office last week. And yes, they did apologize again. I forgave them and welcomed them back into my life. But I may have left out a few irrelevant details. Just some coincidences. For instance, Cheryl's family? They're not exactly law-abiding citizens. Some of them are big guys who like to get into the occasional bar fight. There's even talk, totally irrelevant to this story, that a few of them work for a shady group of businessmen, but it's just gossip, really. Don't get caught up in it. A few days before Peter and Cheryl showed up, the local news reported on a personal trainer who'd been brutally mugged right after leaving his gym. He had tried to fight off 5 attackers, but they overpowered him. The muggers made off with his wallet and car, stripped him naked, and savagely beat him. The attack left him with a broken jaw, shattered nose, cracked ribs, a broken arm, a dislocated kneecap, and ruptured testicles. The poor guy will be hospitalized for at least a couple of weeks, though doctors say he should recover after extensive surgery and physical therapy. The crime has shaken up the town, but there are no leads on the attackers. They wore dark clothes, gloves, and ski masks, leaving no clues behind. Although the trainer will likely be out of commission for a while, the doctors believe he'll fully heal, though it'll take months. His car was taken to a chop shop, his credit cards were maxed out, his bank accounts drained, and his identity was stolen, opening a whole new mess of legal problems. Rachel seemed to be in a bad mood for almost a week after the news about the mugging. I thought it was just her worry about the increasing crime in the area. She didn't even seem to appreciate my suggestion to upgrade the security system at the house. Monday morning, I gave my lawyer the go-ahead to finalize the divorce paperwork. I told him to serve Rachel by Friday. That afternoon, he tried to convince me to hold off, but I wasn't about to change my mind. By Tuesday, everything was set, and the documents were ready for me to sign. When I met my lawyer to review the papers, he warned me once more to reconsider. After some thought, I agreed to give Rachel the house and even the investments, but I made it crystal clear that I wouldn't give her a penny beyond that. If she kept the house, she'd be on the hook for the mortgage and utilities. Not that it mattered much, since there hadn't been a cent in the investment accounts for over a month. I had no issue giving her 100% of zero. What Rachel didn't know was that I'd been slowly removing all my tools and equipment from the garage, along with anything else I wanted to keep. My larger items went to Peter and Cheryl's ranch, while smaller stuff made its way to a one-bedroom apartment I rented through an offshore LLC. The owners of that LLC were nearly impossible to track down, which was exactly how I wanted it. Friday morning, I stuck to my usual routine and headed to work. A couple of days earlier, I had Peter help me move my truck to the office. I left my car at the office, hopped into the truck, and drove straight to the bank. I cleaned out all of our accounts, leaving just $100 in both the checking and savings. After that, I emptied the safety deposit box, taking everything to the ranch where I combined it with the rest of my things. I didn't want to risk them finding out about any new safety deposit boxes I might have opened elsewhere, nor did I want to leave a paper trail for them to trace. I figured the cash would come in handy later. You might wonder why I trusted Peter and Cheryl. It was simple. The mortgage on their ranch was held by an offshore LLC with sketchy ownership. Plus, despite everything that had happened, Peter was still family, and you just don't mess with family. It didn't hurt that the rest of the family would back me up in a heartbeat. When Peter and I reconciled, it brought a lot of joy to everyone. When I returned home that late morning, I parked a few blocks away to check the GPS tracker I'd placed in Rachel's car. Sure enough, she was at the mall. I rushed back to the house, parked in the driveway, and quickly grabbed the last of my things. Over the past few days, I'd packed up all my clothes and belongings, stashing them in the garage. I threw everything into the truck, grabbing armloads of clothes, hangers and all. It didn't take long, just a few trips, and I had everything loaded. I didn't bother closing the garage or even locking the front door. My phone rang as I was leaving. It was Rachel, presumably. She couldn't pay for something at the store. I saw the GPS signal on her car moving closer to home and couldn't help but laugh. I tossed the phone onto the table and walked out. A few minutes later, I was blocks away, heading for my new apartment. When I arrived, I unloaded the truck and set up everything in my new place. 3 beers later, I was sitting back in my recliner when my new phone rang. Only a few people had this number, and Rachel wasn't one of them. I answered, and the voice on the other end told me she'd been served. They said I'd get the video soon. I replied with a simple, "Okay, thank you," and hung up. True to their word, just 15 minutes later, I got the video in my email. It was clear she was completely blindsided. The footage didn't show much beyond her being served. Then she dropped to the floor in shock. The process server made sure she wasn't injured before leaving. That's where the video ended. I could only imagine how she reacted when she started reading the divorce petition and realized I had DNA and video evidence of her betrayal. After that, things moved at an excruciatingly slow pace. I got several phone calls, some from my old office, since Rachel had been calling nonstop, desperately trying to get in touch. Apparently, she didn't believe the staff when they told her I'd resigned and hadn't been there for the past couple of weeks. She even showed up in person demanding to speak with me, but that didn't go well. The police were called to escort her off the property. Peter made a few calls of his own. Rachel, suspicious about his unexpected appearance right after the divorce, began pressuring him to contact me. He was forced to file a restraining order against her to stop her from hounding him. 2 weeks later, my lawyer reached out to her, asking who her attorney was, but she hadn't hired one yet. She was rapidly running out of money, left with only the cash in her purse and the $200 I had left in the bank accounts. She started leaning on her parents for support. I took my time, avoiding any projects for the moment and staying out of sight, not wanting to leave anything behind that she could snatch. Eventually, she got herself a lawyer, and meetings were set. I made it clear to my lawyer, no more money, period. Tempers flared during those meetings, which led to arbitration, something I had to attend. However, it didn't go in her favor. During the proceedings, questions arose about the missing money. Rachel exploded, shouting, "Where's all the money, idiot? What money? All our money. We're broke. I'm living in the cheapest one-bedroom apartment I could find because it's all I could afford." Her tone was frantic. The truth was, the money wasn't there. I had drained the accounts, investing it in the only thing that seemed worth it, getting away from her. As for the house, we were giving her the place with her name on the title. My lawyer made a point, but it felt like he was describing the aftermath of a hurricane, noting that at least the building hadn't burned down. The mortgage was maxed out, and I couldn't afford the monthly payments. Rachel was beside herself, and it all quickly fell apart. As for child support, not my kids, not my responsibility. Spousal maintenance? No job, no income. No way. She demanded 70% of the liquid assets, but there were none. She wanted 50% of the business? Dream on. 150% of the retirement fund? That was gone too. The arbitration was a complete disaster. Then came the day in court, facing the notoriously tough Judge Laura Bennett. She was one of those feminist, man-hating family court judges, especially harsh on men whose wives had cheated. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't planning to sit there and try to explain myself. The financial records would speak for themselves. The judge immediately began using those numbers to calculate what I owed. The thing is, she had no access to the real picture. I had been busy moving funds around for weeks, shuffling them between various banks and accounts. I even took money out of one bank and deposited it into several others. Of course, these accounts weren't under my name, they were under aliases. One of those accounts had even been set up through a business of Cheryl's family, a silly gag gift shop where you could purchase fake IDs for entertainment purposes only. I once had an ID that said I was Jesus Christ just for the laughs, just to see people's faces when they realized they just shouted the name out loud. Back in front of that judge, now 60 days into my 90-day stay in county jail, short-term sentences, she sneered at me and asked, "Have you learned your lesson yet?" I shot back, "Don't marry a cheating spouse. I learned that long before your court." She scowled, obviously irritated. Her forehead vein was throbbing, probably not ideal for her blood pressure. I brushed off her concerns about my attitude, expressing more concern for her health as she seemed to be getting worked up over the trivialities of my situation, especially as I was being treated like an animal in front of a pack of kangaroos. I jokingly suggested that her blood pressure must skyrocket at the doctor's office. Her response was sharp. She threatened to extend my jail time, tacking on another 30 days just for my attitude. Then, she got to the point of the meeting. She wanted to know why I hadn't made any child support or maintenance payments to my ex-wife yet. She also asked why my lawyer wasn't there, wondering if they were out of town. Clearly frustrated, she mistakenly assumed that being smart was some kind of prerequisite for being a judge, and I took the opportunity to correct her. I responded with a sarcastic quip about how I was happy to enlighten her. "Sorry if it's still over your head," I said, "but I'll try to keep it simple. The lowest I can go is so a fifth grader can understand it. Do try to keep up." At that moment, I was genuinely concerned that her bench might catch fire from the steam coming out of her ears. By then, it seemed like she might actually dislike me. I snapped back, "I'm in jail. I can't access any money. You put me here. So no, I can't send any money. What part of that do you not understand?" I then asked her to explain how, in her mind, she was the reason my ex-wife couldn't get the money she tried to steal from me in the first place. "Are you getting this? Or should I explain it to you slower?" After that, I was escorted back to my cell for another stretch, an additional 90 days on top of the original sentence. 30 days for my outburst in court, another 30 from her as a warning, and a final 30 as a parting gift for my attitude. Honestly, it wasn't so bad. The food wasn't great, but it wasn't the worst either, and I had a comfortable bed to sleep in. The free time was a bonus, and I made use of the gym facilities to keep fit. Things went pretty smoothly inside. Word spread quickly about my courtroom antics, which earned me some respect and a few friends. And did I mention Cheryl's family has some connections on the inside? That definitely helped keep things calm. The only real issue came from Rachel's less-than-bright cousin. He had this idea that getting arrested for a minor offense and spending a week in jail would somehow teach me a lesson. It didn't take long for the whole jail to figure out his plan. He was recognizable from a mile away. It started with him accidentally getting hit by a few random inmates. A stray elbow during a football toss, a basketball to the gut, and a couple more accidental collisions. After a few near misses, he made his way over to me, only to try a sucker punch while my back was turned. I was ready, though. I spun around and landed a kick to his groin that would have made a football kicker proud. That sent him stumbling straight to the infirmary. 2 days later, he was refusing yard time and mostly stayed locked in his cell until his release. When I found myself back in court, the judge was eager to ask if I was ready to apologize. I told her I wasn't sure what she was talking about. She snapped that I needed to watch my tongue or risk having my sentence extended further. At this point, I was beyond frustrated. I sarcastically remarked that maybe another judge would take over soon and I might even start stomping my feet, just to give her something to worry about. I pointed out the glaring issue that none of the financial obligations, child support, maintenance, mortgage, or utilities, had been paid as ordered. I reminded her that I couldn't pay anything while locked up, as I couldn't work in here. I added that since the kids weren't mine, they were no longer my responsibility. I told her flat out that my ex-wife had been unfaithful and should have to fend for herself. Maybe she could charge for her services if she needed money that badly. As the conversation continued, I reminded her that I had given Rachel half of the business. She should have more than enough to live on. Rachel's lawyer cut in at that point, revealing that they'd been unable to claim Rachel's share of the business because it had been sold to an overseas entity a couple of months before the divorce was filed. They hadn't been able to trace the new owners yet, so they couldn't address the court order properly. Suddenly, an attractive woman stepped forward, identifying herself as a representative of the board of directors for the company that had acquired my business. She moved to have the court's ruling dismissed, arguing that Mrs. Parker should not receive any portion of the business that belonged to her ex-husband. According to her, it was irregular to award ownership of the business without the company's involvement, especially since the sale had taken place before the divorce. This company, she pointed out, had no connection to the case at hand and had no intention of acknowledging any claim from Mrs. Parker. Someone in the courtroom asked about the money from the sale. The young woman responded, explaining that the transfer of ownership and the payment had been handled overseas. I don't have full details, but from what I understand, the funds from the sale never entered the U.S. They weren't subject to U.S. laws. Any claim on that money would need to be addressed with your ex-husband, and potentially in the country where those funds are now located. Rachel's lawyer, growing desperate, asked, "What country is that?" The young woman answered, "The original transaction took place in Italy, but my understanding is that the money was transferred to another location shortly after the sale. I have no idea where it ended up." Next, my ex's lawyer spoke up again, pleading for help. The house was facing foreclosure because the mortgage hadn't been paid in 3 months, and the utilities were on the brink of being shut off. My ex's lawyer mentioned that her parents had pitched in a bit at first, but it was becoming too much for them to handle. Despite my ex securing a job as a waitress, the income was not enough to keep up with the house payments. The judge then turned to me and stated I had 1 week to bring all payments up to date. I responded with a sarcastic remark, suggesting I should bend over and pull cash out of a place where it didn't exist. I reiterated that I was physically unable to pay because I was in jail with no access to any funds. Since I couldn't work, there was no way for me to come up with any money. I pointed out the flawed assumption that I had stacks of cash just lying around in my cell. I made it clear that there was no way for me to comply with their orders. I explained I had no lawyer, no financial means, and no access to my own records. I questioned where all these phantom accounts were that they kept referring to and pointed out that even if they existed, I wouldn't be able to get the information to access them. I challenged them to show me these mysterious accounts, especially any funds from my company's sale, which had been in bad shape due to poor investments. I had sold it for a low price just to cover expenses, leaving no extra funds behind. The courtroom remained skeptical, and I shrugged, uninterested in trying to convince them. I told them if they wanted to believe there was hidden money somewhere, that was their problem. But I knew the truth. I had nothing. I added that it made as much sense as keeping me locked up without access to money while demanding I make payments that I simply couldn't afford. The judge, still unmoved, asked if I understood that she could keep me in jail until the payments were made. I looked at her as if she had just sprouted a third eye. "Oh, absolutely," I said, playing along. "It makes perfect sense to keep me in here, unable to meet your demands, while you keep making them." Seems like a great plan. 3 months later, the house went into foreclosure, and Rachel lost her Lexus due to missed payments. Unable to afford an apartment for herself and her daughters, she moved in with her parents and kept working part-time at the diner. Desperate, they came back to the judge, pleading for my release so that I could begin making payments. Meanwhile, lover boy, fresh out of the hospital and engaged in physical therapy, spent his days trying, unsuccessfully, to resolve his financial problems. The one upside for him was that no new credit cards could be opened in his name due to his severely damaged credit score. With minimal insurance on his car and working part-time at the gym, he had little to help with his mounting medical bills, which were made worse by high deductibles. After securing legal representation, I struck a deal with the judge. I would be released from jail to find a job and begin making payments. I had to surrender my passport, as they suspected I might have hidden funds or might try to flee. I ended up getting a job at Taco Bell and moved into the ranch with Peter and Cheryl. Though I knew I was being discreetly watched, I was aware that most of the money was already in my possession. This routine continued for the next 3 months. Rachel used a court order to garnish my meager paycheck from Taco Bell, but the results were barely worth mentioning. Meanwhile, I made arrangements with Peter to clear out my apartment while I was still locked up. My belongings were divided up among my extended family, and they shipped them to a shared location that was kept off the radar of any surveillance. Guests, under the guise of casual visits and barbecues, discreetly transferred the packages to their cars. Over the next few weeks, I kept a low profile, spending most of my time either at work or at the ranch, doing my best to avoid going out. Eventually, Taco Bell had to get a restraining order against Rachel because her constant disturbances at the restaurant were becoming a problem. Even though they could have fired me, a quiet, discreet payment to the manager helped keep me employed without further issues. For legal matters, my lawyer came to the ranch. At first, she represented the new owners of my old company in court. Afterward, I hired her for myself. She had a sharp, no-nonsense style, like a barracuda in business attire. She didn't shy away from bending the rules, even when it came to the ethics of a lawyer-client relationship. I joked that in Russia, lawyers considered scruples as currency, with morals just being large decorative paintings on walls. "All right," I said one day. "I'm sure you're wondering about my finances. Yes, I did sell my business. No, I didn't sell it to myself. I wasn't going to give Rachel any chance to grab hold of something that could get her a piece of the company. I was cutting ties with it because, frankly, I wanted the cash. The sale took place overseas, and the money never entered U.S. jurisdiction. That meant it wasn't bound by U.S. laws. Rachel couldn't touch a dime unless I transferred it into a U.S. bank, which would expose it to her claims because of the judgments against me. That wasn't going to happen. The sale was a substantial amount, and when you add in my investments, which were worth around $10 million, it was a pretty solid haul. On top of that, I had about $200,000 in cash across a safety deposit box, checking and savings accounts, and some hidden safes. Some of that money was earmarked for my plans, but I still had roughly $150,000 left. And no, I wasn't planning on taking any of that cash with me. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon when all of this came together. We were hosting another barbecue with the extended family. Everything was prepared, and the vibe was just right. The party went off without a hitch. I helped Peter with the grill and the smoker, and my lawyer, Julia, was there too. Later in the day, one of Cheryl's uncles came up to me, expressing his thanks for helping out with everything and saying how glad he was that we'd reconnected. We chatted for a while, and then he handed me an envelope. I passed it to Julia for safekeeping without anyone noticing. As the evening wore on, I made an announcement. The ranch's mortgage had been paid off, thanks to the lion holder, and now Peter and Cheryl owned it outright. The news set off a huge celebration. We partied well into the night, and by the time the guests began to leave, everyone was in high spirits. Julia couldn't stay the night, as she had an early flight the next morning. She left with a group of 6 cars, heading off in the direction of the airport. Interestingly, her flight wasn't out of our local airport but one in the next state over. She had packed her bags earlier and had everything ready to go in her leased car when she came to the party. She didn't even go back to her rented apartment. She just headed straight for the airport. No one noticed the man slipping out of the back of Julia's car in the parking garage. Nor did anyone see the man strolling casually 50 feet behind her as they made their way toward the international terminal. Michael Bennett was prohibited from leaving the United States due to the court order that had him surrender his passport. Mitchell Nelson's passport, however, passed through unnoticed. No one paid any attention as they sat together, holding hands in the adjoining first-class seats, bound for Mexico City. And just like that, Julia Davis vanished. In her place, Jimmy Nelson boarded the connecting flight with Mitchell Nelson to Ecuador. 2 days later, Greg and Samantha Cooper arrived at their remote getaway on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, swiftly earning themselves membership in the Mile High Club. Strangely enough, an old Chevy pickup, exactly like the one that had disappeared from Peter and Cheryl's ranch, was waiting for them. 2 weeks after the barbecue, a bench warrant was issued for Michael Bennett's arrest. He was fired shortly afterward for failing to show up to work, with no notice and no alimony payments to his ex-wife. When Peter and Cheryl found themselves in court, their lawyer, dressed in a drab $5,000 skirt suit, argued that the couple had no responsibility toward their cousin, who had rented a room and then vanished. They even filed a suit against him for unpaid back rent. Their only explanation was that he had driven off in his old pickup one afternoon and never came back. The story didn't hold up, but with no evidence to contradict it, no one could prove otherwise. In the following years, Greg Cooper ran a modest charter fishing boat, while Samantha managed their cantina. Life was good in the small village where they lived in one of the larger haciendas, surrounded by luxury. They were prosperous, and visitors came from time to time, among them Peter, Cheryl, and other family members. Their life was simple but joyful, with Greg and Sam's love for each other clear to everyone who saw them. Most evenings, they entertained guests in the cantina or at their grand home. They were well-liked and accepted quickly by the community, and whenever a need arose, they were quick to offer help. Greg also dabbled in the stock market when he wasn't out on the boat or managing the cantina, even setting up accounts for some of the locals and helping them with their finances. As for the dishonorable judge, Laura Bennett, I couldn't help but laugh years after my escape to Costa Rica. It turned out that Judge Bennett's wife, who had built a reputation for her man-hating ways, was caught having an affair. To make things worse for the judge, he had adopted her 3 children when they married, and since their divorce, he'd been stuck paying child support, maintenance, and covering her house payments. To add insult to injury, his ex-wife wasted no time moving her boyfriend in with her, and they publicly carried on with their affair. Though they weren't officially married, they lived together as though they were. Rumors started circulating that their wedding was set for exactly 1 week after their youngest son graduated from college, which also happened to mark the end of Judge Bennett's financial obligations to his ex-wife.